morning. It's raining in Berlin, so you might have been tempted to take your car this morning to come to work. But that would have been a mistake because there's a high state visit and they're suddenly shut down streets anyhow. But if it had been a car, it should have been an electric vehicle. Although, of course, we're not quite there. The market is in the process of developing. And we have a fantastic panel of experts today to look at how that's going. And we'll start with a discussion of first, how countries subsidize the automotive sector. And I think I can already reveal that most of the subsidies go to the electric vehicle part of it. And then we will look into a concept developed by Zukunft KlimaSozial and Agora Verkehrswende here in Berlin of how subsidies could be better used to target those most in need, so to help those who find it difficult to switch to an electric car. After that, we will open the big umbrella of questions regarding about how you target subsidies, not only to those most in need, but also to make sure that it spurs innovation, framework conditions, new technologies that can help develop the market, make sure that we have the loading infrastructure that is needed. You have it. But before we do that, I ask my colleague Jean Sauvage of the OECD to kickstart our discussion with a new paper on subsidies across countries for the automotive sector. You have the screen, Jean, and we are very curious to hear what you have to say.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Nicola, and good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me just share my screen first. Hopefully this works as expected. Yes. So hello. I'll try to be short because we have a lot of panelists and a lot of interesting things to cover. Let me jump right in by recalling that when we talk about subsidies, I think it's important to remember that subsidies are just one part of the broader set of policies that we might consider to be industrial policies. You can do industrial policies without using subsidies. You can work on making sure you have a skilled labor force that serves the sector. You can work on innovation policies. You can do a lot of things on the regulatory front. You have, of course, trade policies, make it easier to import inputs and so on. But then there's subsidies. So why do we care about subsidies in particular here? And I mean producer subsidies in this case. Well, it's because there's a potential for subsidies to really affect competition and trade in ways that are cross-border, in ways that affects your neighbors, in ways that affect the level playing field, so that it's not considered level affair. So in what follows, I will focus essentially on producer subsidies, on the understanding that our panelists will cover consumer subsidies and other aspects of this industrial policy ecosystem. So what do we know about industrial subsidies writ large? So we have this database at the OECD called the OECD Magic Database. I can talk a bit more about it in Q&A if necessary. I won't get into details. Essentially, it's a confidential firm-level database where we go through the financial statements of every big company in every sector we cover, and that includes car makers, of course. So we cover about 85% of the global car market with our samples, so it's very significant. And what we can see when we put all of this together, all of this data, is this picture, which shows three big things, three key messages I want to take away from this graph. The first is that industrial subsidies are reaching in 23 the highest level since the global financial crisis. That's true when we express the subsidies as a share from revenue. It's true in nominal dollars. It's true at constant prices as well. So we do see a resurgence of subsidies that's undeniable. And the second takeaway is that all three kinds of subsidies we measure currently, so like grants, tax breaks, and below market loans, do seem to matter. All three of them do seem to play a role. And the third takeaway is that when you look at support in general, but specifically below market loans, they tend to be counter-cyclical. So they tend to spike when you have crisis or problems. So unsurprisingly, the big spike you see in 2009 was the rescue of Detroit car makers during the financial crisis through cheap loans, or at least below market loans. When you put this data together, but not over time, but you average all of this by sector, and then you express it relative to the size of the sector, you have the following picture. You see that the most subsidized sectors are solar panels, the production of solar panels, not the installation, semiconductors, and aluminum. Cars looks like the least subsidized sector. So you might think it's fine, no problem. Like, why do we worry about cars then? So a couple of things. First, the reason why car looks so small is because, again, it's relative to the size of the sector, and the car industry is huge. It's the biggest sector of all 15 we cover. It is an essential sector in terms of jobs, value chain, suppliers, multiple tiers of suppliers. It's very integrated globally, so it does matter a great deal. And so, of course, the denominator will be so large that it might make subsidies look very small. But then there's another issue as well, which is the aggregates can hide a lot of action happening below these aggregates. So if we split the sample for car makers in our database between what we call the pure play EV makers, so Tesla, XPeng, NIO, BYD, and so on the one hand, and then what we call the legacy car makers on the other, so your Stellantis, Renault, Toyota, GM, and so on, you have an interesting contrast in terms of the subsidy intensity or the subsidies they receive as a share of their revenue. Now, one reason for this is also because EV sales are lower, so the revenue might be lower. So as firms grow their sales, you see the ratio coming down and some more convergence. But still, even then, for large EV players, for example, we do see a big difference in the ratio, which I think is interesting. And what's interesting as well is that despite receiving these subsidies, a lot of pure play EV makers are struggling to make a profit, with notable exceptions that I will touch upon. If you look on the right-hand side, you see that most pure play EV makers have never made a profit or only recently began to make profits. The big exception here is BYD, which I've put on the left side together with legacy car makers because they have comparable returns on assets. One question is why that is so. My understanding is that it's partly the fact because of the vertical integration of BYD, because batteries are so important to the overall cost of building an EV, that if you do your own batteries like BYD does with the technology they have, it makes them more profitable. But I'm happy to hear from the panel who are surely more expert than I am on the car market to understand why that is the case. When we split the subsidies not by segment, not by sector, but actually by the headquarters location of the companies, so where firms are based, we see a big contrast between Chinese car makers and everyone else. There's a big difference. It's true for the legacy car makers in China, so the older companies in China like Dongfeng, like SAIC, and so on. It's true for the more recent ones like BYD, XPeng, NIO, and so on. It's a big contrast. The contrast is actually even higher when you realize that what we put in OECD North America might include the subsidies in China that American car makers receive in China for the Chinese subsidiaries. However, what's interesting is that until recently, these Chinese car makers were basically operating in China for China. So they were not really international in scope. You can see that most of their physical assets used in production were located in China, not abroad. And most of the revenue was made, almost all of it was made in China, so selling to Chinese domestic market. But it's a big contrast with what you see for the OECD-based car makers, whether North America, Japan, Korea, or Europe, who were much more international. So they had factories everywhere and they were selling outside their home jurisdiction. Now we see this changing. So in the last few years, you see for the percentage of domestic revenue that Chinese car makers generate is going down, which indicates that they start to be more international in scope and it start to basically go abroad. And finally, one last thing I wanted to leave you with. This graph is not from me, it's from Bloomberg, but I thought it was interesting to show is to also mention the importance of the value chain, because I mentioned throughout the presentation car makers, but I think it's important to understand that your presence as a car maker is only the result of a lot of multiple tiers of suppliers and a long supply chain, like I mentioned, that's very globally integrated. And when you look at this supply chain for many green industries, including batteries, you see a very strong geographical concentration that I think is interesting to put in relation with the subsidy debate. Now, that doesn't mean that the only reason why you see this picture is because of subsidies. So subsidies might explain only part of this picture. And I would be interested to hear also from other people during this event what they think, why they think that is the case. what are the key drivers behind this picture you see here now, and to what extent subsidies did play a role in shaping this structure here. Finally, I want to also flag some new OECD work we have that will be released pretty soon. So it's a joint work between the Trade and Agriculture Directorate of the OECD, but also the Economics Department, where we've looked at the econometric effects of these subsidies I showed you on market shares. And we did find some causal effects of subsidies on firms' market share, global market shares, which I think goes toward the idea that, yes, some of this picture is actually caused by subsidies, but maybe not all of it. So that's all I had. I wanted to be very short and crisp and provide a very broad overview. And I'll be very interested to hear also what others say. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thanks a lot, Jean. That was a super, international landscape of producer subsidies. And now I would like to ask Brigitte Knopf of Zukunft KlimaSozial to present her work that she's prepared together with Agora Energiewende, more on the consumer subsidies, because we saw there are a lot of subsidies already on the producer side. There are more on the consumer side. And it's true that subsidies are not everything to develop the market. But if we have them, we want them to be targeted and impactful. And Brigitte and Agora Energiewende have thought about how to do that. So Brigitte, you have the screen.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nicolas, for inviting me. And actually, it's Agora Verkehrswende. And I'm happy to present the study we published early this year together with Agora Verkehrswende and Marion Viehweg. She's on the panel later on. She had actually the project lead in that study. So what was the motivation for us? The motivation was really to bring the three dimensions together of how to design subsidy schemes. And one of the aspects is the climate dimension. So in Germany, we're very far from meeting our own targets in the transport sector. So this causes also problems for meeting the effort sharing targets for 2030 in Germany. So the climate dimension is really important here to get to make progress in the transport sector. Then the second dimension is what you already mentioned, Nicola, the social dimension. So in 2027, the ETS2 starts, and we really need to avoid the fossil fuel lock-in for low and middle income households. So that is one dimension, but also the other dimension, how can we enable participation so that we do not just have high income households to participate in the EV market. And then the third dimension, the industrial policy dimension. Of course, in Germany we have a huge car industry. They are in a difficult economic situation, and so how can we invent effective subsidies that cover all three aspects? And that was our main motivation. So I will start with two examples of how to do it and how not to do it. So first of all, how not to do it. That's the example of Germany. We had the so-called Umweltbonus until last year, so a purchase subsidy. And what you see here, so this is the income structure who benefited from that subsidy, purchase subsidy. This is the median income, so very few households only benefited in that category, while roughly 80% were in the higher income groups. So here we clearly see a social imbalance in this subsidy scheme. A much better example is what, at least in Germany, we call it social leasing. In France it's called leasing électrique. So the eligibility criteria to get that for the leasing was a reference income of roughly 50,000 euro. It's a median income, it's a weighted median income, so responding to that one I showed here before, and was connected to commuting and the leasing of about 100 euro per month. And what's quite interesting, I think it really met those who needed the support. So 40% here, these are the income deciles, and 40% of all beneficiaries fall within the three lowest income deciles. So really targeted to low income groups. I think this is a quite good example. So when we now look at low income households, what are their specific needs? Well, of course, they have, these are the share of new cars, so very low share of new cars in these households. And when they have a new car, then it's mainly small and compact cars. But now when we look at what is available at the car market, then the problem is that only very few vehicles are available in a range that would be attractive for low and middle income households. So here, only very few are available, or hardly any are available below 40,000 euros. And that's even too much for a low and middle income household. So for a low and middle income households, one point we stressed in the study is that also the used car market is quite important. So because these households, they hardly have any new cars, they go for used cars. But also when we think of a new car, EV car of 60,000, and then a used car, when we think of a resale value of 50%, then that would be 30,000 for a used car. Even that is too high costs for a middle income household. So we need more cars in that category here. So cars with a price of less than 30,000 euros to be affordable for low income households. So that is what we have here, the current situation that changes over time, of course. But we have to take this into account when we design a subsidy program. So from the perspective of the car market, what would be important for the subsidy programs? So first of all, funding should be targeted at fully electric vehicles and no plug-in hybrids. In Germany, we will have that discussion, plug-in hybrids again, but this should be really on fully electric vehicles. And then what I said before, so the subsidy limit, it must be appropriate. So it should be low enough to reach lower and middle income groups. But on the other hand, if the price is too low, then we do not have any cars available in that category. So it should be high enough to ensure that there are sufficient vehicles in the market that are suitable. You could also think of this to a staggered approach in relation to the price of the new car. That could be one design option. And again, what we say that the used car market, that's quite important for low and middle income households. And it's also important to ramp up the EV market. So a temporary subsidy for used cars could also be, or would also be an important design feature of a subsidy program. So that was from the perspective of the car market. Then we looked at different design options for subsidy schemes. So I'm not going to read all that. It's a summary. So we analyzed 4 options. So purchase subsidies, where it's quite simple to, and we looked at the advantages and disadvantages from the perspective of the social dimension, and also the implementation is quite important. In Germany, we do not have the administrative realization of the subsidy scheme is sometimes really tricky. So therefore, we had a specific focus on how really to implement that. So purchase subsidies are quite simple to realize, but or in a sense, simple to realize, but people with who do not have enough money, also a purchase subsidy will not be enough to enable them to buy an EV. So therefore, subsidized leasing might be an option. This is also possible for households who do not have enough equity capital available. In Germany, actually, leasing is less attractive compared, for example, to France. And the problem is that there are hidden costs for repairs or for insurances and so on. And also the implementation process is a little bit more tricky and difficult. So we also proposed subsidized loans. Again, because you need probably some bridge funding for people who do not have enough financial assets, and owing is more attractive than leasing, at least in Germany. But of course, also hidden costs must be taken into account. And then we have the income tax concessions that's already available and simple to realize, but it has a regressive distributional effect, at least in the German tax system. So these are the different options, and then we have to match it on the other hand with the dimensions of vulnerability, of transport poverty. So now at the EU level, this is being discussed how to define this, because it's also a kind of feature in the Social Climate Fund, how this is defined. There are different dimensions. So here, I mean, what's one simple dimension is the lack of financial resources. But then you could also think of the dimension who has a high burden, who has a high commuting distance, for example, and is dependent on the car and is then tied to higher fuel prices when the price in the ETS2 increases, for example. One other important dimension is the lack of alternatives. So is public transport available or not? So this is different from the city, for example, to the countryside. And charging infrastructure is also a kind of important dimension. So these are different dimensions to consider when we design subsidy programs. Here are some examples for eligibility criteria. So income, I mentioned that, car ownership, availability of public transport, commuting distance. So you can get very specific. These are just some options, and in the paper we have a long list of pros and cons and different design options. The same for specific requirements for cars, so you can put different price limits for cars. In EU countries, we looked at that, so there are different limits in countries between 30,000 and 60,000 euro, and you could also add some maximum wide carbon footprint or whatever. So as I said, this can get very specific. In Germany, now in the coalition treaty, it says that they want to finance social leasing programs for EVs from the Social Climate Fund. Actually, for Germany, the Social Climate Fund, there's really not much money in there. So all of the money would then go to social leasing. I'm a little bit skeptical about that one, but you could use that money to design pilot project. So for example, a pilot project where you have the dimension of availability of public transport or commuting distance or whatever. So pilot project might be interesting, and then in the Social Climate Fund, and then to scale it up later with additional money from the ETS2 revenues. So to summarize that, design options from the social perspective. So we very much stress that we need a portfolio of instruments to address different target groups. When you think of leasing or subsidized loans, you have to take into account the hidden risks and hidden costs. Tax concessions are more beneficial for high-income households. And as I said, the administrative implementation, there can be via income tax assessment notice, or, for example, employment contract that's used in France, can also be done in Germany. Yeah, so we made some proposals of really how the administrative implementation can look like. So this is my summarizing slide. What we propose is this two-step approach. So first of all, as I said before, we go for a portfolio of instruments, so purchase subsidies, subsidized leasing, subsidized loans. And then we say we need a two-step approach because first of all, we need a market ramp up of affordable EVs. And this also covers the used car market for EVs. So that's quite important to make it financially attractive for low and middle income households. And we need a paradigm shift in a sense that we really need an entry point for support schemes for low and middle income groups. So that is so far, at least not the situation in Germany, that we have this available. We have it in the building sector. There's a approach, targeted subsidies for low and middle income groups, but so far not in the transport sector. So here we're really arguing for a paradigm shift. So this is the ramp-up phase, and then when enough EVs are available in the lower price segment, you could also think of then more targeted support who really needs support, for example, people who do not have access to public transport or other vulnerable groups. And additional funds can be, or the social climate fund can be used in addition. So that's the summary of the study in a sense. We make many proposals how the design features could be implemented, or which kind of design features we have. Just one last remark, of course, to have inclusive mobility, or inclusive mobility is more than just socially differentiated subsidy programs. We also need public infrastructure. We need regulation, and one part is also, or might be, a climate dividend. So just to broaden the picture a little bit, what means to be socially just transition also in the transport sector. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I have to, sorry, thank you, Brigitte. How can I, can you hear me? No, sorry. We had a major technical event. My internet connection broke physically, so I'm speaking from another room, from Sabine's room. We are trying to manage this, but nonetheless, we will manage, of course. Following this, where's the camera? Here's the camera. So following these two presentations about producer subsidies, the global dimension, and the consumer subsidies, I'm now very happy to ask my panel, which is a very diverse panel, on the screen. You may already have noticed that this is a global event about global EV markets, but with a focus on France and Germany, because Brigitte, she compared the French and the German solutions, but there's more evidence on why this is French-German. One is, I think all of my panelists are either French or German, or sometimes both. They work either in France and Germany. The best evidence that this is Franco-German is, I think, our panelist Nicola Köhler-Suzuki, and Sabine is rushing over there. Oh, I have to pin him, and I don't know how to pin him. I hope that okay, we'll manage. He's from Notre Europe, and Nicola, welcome. And he has developed a European car strategy with Notre Europe, and I think that will be interesting for our further discussion. We also have industry representatives. Well, I should mention first Marion Vierweg from Ogura Verkehrswende, who, as Brigitte already said, is the lead of this study. And we have two industry representatives who represent different parts of the transition to the EV market. First of all, we are welcoming Jean-Luc Di Paola Galloni, and he's another evidence of the French Germanness of this event, from the French embassy in Berlin after an event there. Jean-Luc is from Valeo, traditional, not a car maker, but a supplier, and and this supplier is in the transition itself, moving a little bit to the EV market, but not yet fully. Let's put it that way. And we have Nastaran Kravchik from CM Blue. CM Blue produces batteries, but not car batteries, rather large batteries for long-term storage. And this can be a solution for many things, for the extended electricity networks we need in the future in general for electrification, but also for industry. Storage for their electricity they need for production, can be the car industry, can be many other industries, but also Brigitte mentioned it, we don't have enough of a car charging infrastructure today, but once we do have it, we of course will have to manage the grid quite differently, and then CM Blue technology can help in that respect. So now you're not on the panel yet, not on screen, I think, and I'm a bit lost because I don't know how I do this. And well, anyway, maybe we will just start like this, and Sabine will figure out how to get into the discussion or into the Zoom webinar again, and we'll pin you, and then everybody can see you. But let me start with you, Nicolas. So you saw now. Well, what we saw is that the bulk of subsidies is being spent in China, and for sure, what we're seeing in the EV market, that China is quite advanced with a good. Can you pin them here? No. But I don't know how to pin. Can you pin the people? Yeah. Sorry. And sorry. So we saw that China is quite advanced. The European car market was very strong traditionally, but is perhaps a bit behind in terms of this transition. So what did you come up with in your European car strategy? What is the solution you're proposing here?
Great. Many thanks for that introduction, Nicolas. Just to say that Notre Europe is also otherwise known as the Jacques Delors Institute, with branches in Paris, Berlin, and Brussels. And we did this study together with Sciences Po, with colleagues from the economics department at Sciences Po and the Paris School of International Affairs, where we had a somewhat similar framing to what Brigitte was presenting, with the three different dimensions that she had: social, sustainability, and industrial. The framing that we had was to think about the transition of the European automotive sector as taking part inside of a strategic triangle or a trilemma, where there are competing objectives: decarbonization, competitiveness, and economic security. Now, this is obviously just a framing device, and you can put, for example, the social dimension into the competitiveness aspects or so on. But the important point is that there are competing policy objectives, right? And those are pulling European policies, but also member state policies in different directions, and these are in tension with each other. So for decarbonization at the EU level, we have to target still to fully decarbonize new vehicles by 2035. It's a very political discussion that is still ongoing. There's a review that will come up again. There's the question of competitiveness. The car industry is really a global industry, which needs economies of scale and global markets. And lastly, this question of economic security. Jehan was already hinting at it, that there are questions about the supply chains of electric vehicles that are quite different from the supply chains of internal combustion engine vehicles, where most of the parts and components could be sourced inside of the EU, or inside of other OECD countries. We obviously needed to have the fuel that we had to import from the outside mostly, and which would create its own set of dependencies, but not necessary to produce the car. So that is new with electric vehicles. So the one policy instrument, and as Jehan was saying, there are a lot of different industry policy instruments, and we're looking at a lot of these in our report. But the one that can really pull all of these three corners of this triangle together or tear them apart is really the way that we use public subsidies in this process. And we're really thinking about the two different ways to think about strategies, because there are also existing strategies that we may have to get rid of. There is a whole regime of fossil fuel subsidies that continues to exist, direct and indirect. And these are subsidies on the other side of the equation that could actually slow down the transition, but they obviously have this social dimension that Brigitte was talking about earlier. We all remember the Yellow Vest movement in France, which was very concretely about the impact that scrapping some subsidies can have for the rural population in particular. So, and the second part of that is really that we need to deploy better targeted public support to lower the cost of vehicles. This is echoing what Brigitte was saying, to accelerate some investment into new infrastructure and also to protect vulnerable players in the whole value chain shift. So we have a lot of these dimensions in there. Maybe I leave it at this for now, and we can delve into like more specific areas later, because I know you wanted this to be quite interactive.
Yes, thanks a lot, Nicolas. Yeah, maybe from here we can turn a little bit to Jean-Luc as a long-standing or as a representative of a long-standing traditional, let's say, player in the automotive market. And I understand, Jean-Luc, that Veolia is also striving for a lot of innovation to electrify or to enable electric cars. You weren't here in the beginning, but to summarize very briefly, what we showed is OECD work where we see that there are quite a few, or there's a surge in subsidies to the car market, and it's concentrated more on electric vehicles. So these are producer subsidies. They're very much concentrated also in China, and I matched a little bit with market share. And then Brigitte compared social leasing in France, so leasing électrique, I think you call it, with the subsidies, the consumer subsidies that we have in Germany, arguing that they are not quite as targeted, so they don't reach the people who would otherwise not be able to afford an electric vehicle. And what I want to know from you is, as a traditional player in the car market, is it the right subject in some way? So do we need to think about production subsidies and how they can spur innovation? Do we need to think about consumption subsidies and how they can help poorer consumers access electric cars? Or is it none of this at all, and it's much more about framework condition, regulations, how you can access raw materials that are needed? From your perspective, what is halting the transition to sustainable mobility, let's call it that way, in Europe in particular, but also in other countries where you're operating?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to this panel. There couldn't be a better illustration of Franco-German cooperation, because I am in the Charles de Gaulle Salon of the Französische Botschaft in Berlin here, Pariser Platz. And indeed, I just exited, I couldn't join before, a meeting between French and German tiers, together with both governments, French and German. I will answer your point, and thank you very much, Nicola, for bringing it at the right, I would say, openness. Because indeed, I think as a tier that is global, that is, first of all, I want to reassure the think tanks and the NGOs and the consumer studies here. Valeo is committed, first of all, from the beginning, to be an actor towards electrification. I just remind what is the statistics. We wish the BEV market was at the stage of uptake that we were expecting when we were making forecasts 10 years ago. But even as of now, with what is at stake, we supply basically 1 electric motor solution out of 2, regardless of the customer, of the OEM in Europe, and 1 out of 3 in the world, which means we address the Asian market, we address the American market as well. And I will also make some statements there. I knew, and while preparing my points, and I fully respect the end user and the consumer also focus of the panel and the previous speakers, and I very much welcome what they said when I was able to catch up. Sorry for that, but I warned that I couldn't be perfectly on time at 10 a.m. Truly, I'm just a B2B. I respect and I welcome and I push whatever schemes that were done. Now, we need to have a bit of a reality check, and this is also why probably OECD wanted to have this panel. This has not worked the way we were expecting it to work. If we go, because indeed, whether you take the French or the German system, there is not enough market uptake. And the way the idea that by regulation and with an environmental target that would bring a market uptake naturally, that may happen, but it does not happen for many reasons, and also reasons we couldn't prevent. I mean, who could have predicted war in Ukraine with the immediate consequence for example, the German economy not to have any longer cheap energy bought from Russia because of the situation that has completely shifted. Then who could have predicted that the competitiveness of China in the whole value chain of production in automotive sector would have brought advantages of competitiveness that are not matched in Europe, including because of subsidies. Hence, what 2 years ago the Commission, European Commission, started to check on how those subsidies of production were done. So basically, nowadays, if you look at the world globally, even before the American administration has launched this series of tariffs, Europe is in a clear objective disadvantages, I would say, level in terms of subsidies, starting from the production, from the conception, and then obviously also not at the level of the expectation of penetration of BEV. Mm-hmm. So for us as industry,
he's a bit
to look at our survival in Europe. Sorry?
I think you're a bit interrupted a little bit, but it's fine. We can hear you. Just, I just wondering whether I'm the only one who has the problem. No. Okay. But we hear you. Yeah, sorry. Go on.
Okay. So for us, it's a bit like I take the paradigm when you fly, and when they say, in case of drop of air, you just need to help yourself before. What I mean by that, I mean that we need to really look at what is the priority stake. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, we are at risk in Europe, which is a big part of OECD countries, members, to completely be removed of business if we don't safeguard properly the automotive industry from the conception, the design, the production, up to the consumption. And indeed, this is indeed why the European Commission, starting from her president, set up the strategic dialogue to take really urgent measures. And of course, we completely support that. And we need to get a level playing field that reestablish a resilience of the value chain and indeed of the suppliers, and to install a fair competition amongst the players. And we welcome completely the Chinese OEMs in Europe, provided that the supply chains also remain in Europe. This is super important because it also brings clarity in terms of prices for the end consumer. And I represent a tier one that is able to make money for very cheap EVs. And this is a positive message also to bring. Because we are here for the EV, the full BEV Dacia, the full BEV Logans that will come to the market. And these are BEVs that are way below 20,000 euros for the end user. So we need to safeguard that market. And I'm very sensitive to what has been described before, that we need to let grow a market where particularly the low and middle income can come to this shift of decarbonized solutions through electrification. So in a nutshell, I agree with what has been said before. As Nicolas said, yes, we need to push even more accessibility. It's many years that we are claiming, and this is quite honestly not in my bucket, because I am not Schneider Electric. I am not representing cities, associations of countries on how to better develop, particularly in rural areas, in the electricity access for BEVs. But at the same time, we are welcoming the regulatory push, which brings technology of better long range of PHEV, which oblige the consumer to use electric mobility, not just for 20 miles or 30 kilometers, but for 150 and 200, and maybe help the regulator to check that when you purchase a vehicle with Raging Center, you're indeed using the electricity energy and not the internal combustion engine.
Okay.
But on the other hand, as I said, we need to bring the local content as a really important point for Europe if we want to respect the coherence on supplying the regions as we are supplying America and Asia.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Jean-Luc. We were able to hear most of what you were saying. Marion, in a way, before I turn to Nastaran, because she is basically the element for another, perhaps, framework condition that might be lacking. But I want to turn to you, Marion, because you were nodding a lot, right? And in our initial presentations, we didn't put it as dramatically as Jean-Luc did, because of course his company is concerned, and he was talking about survival a little bit, right? So that's perhaps how much the Chinese market is in advance. We did have a comment in the chat that, and I read that too, that the EV uptake was a record high in Europe. So I think it's possible. But what I would like to hear from you, also building on Nicolas' presentation or remarks, Marion, is where apart from good consumption subsidies that go to the right people, where do you see the sticking points? Where does Europe need to do more in this particular case in order to, well, stay in the game, given that they were good in the game we played before, and to master this transition?
Yeah, I think really in Germany we have a very different situation to many other countries in Europe, and I think just taking a step back, that was also a bit the motivation behind our paper. With the sudden cut of the subsidies at the end of 2023, we just saw this massive drop in demand and in sales in EVs in Germany. And basically from being a front runner, or at least good in the game, we've really dropped back to one of the laggards as one of the biggest economies in Europe. So really stressing how important these subsidies still are in this market that is not yet a self-sustaining consumer market. It's not the natural choice of the consumer yet to buy an EV. And that has many reasons. And of course, subsidies is only one element that influences the consumer decision at the end of the day. Unfortunately, in Germany, at least, we have a very negative general perception in many areas of electric vehicles. Also, that has to do with the political situation, but also with some real issues that we have in terms of charging infrastructure, prices for more even than charging infrastructure, because a lot has happened in the last few years in terms of building up charging infrastructure, and we actually see an under deployment of the existing infrastructure, but prices are too high, and that is still one of the a key problem that we face in the German market. So I think we've seen the comment in that there has been this rapid uptake in the first quarter of 2025, also in Germany. And I think that is a very good example how regulation works, because of course that is a direct result of the CO2 fleet regulation and the new targets for 2025. So we see that it is possible. We see how many models have come on the market just in the last 6 months. Also more affordable models in the lower ranges. So apparently regulation works. So for us, I think it's really, really important to keep that momentum going and keep the regulation in place, to be very clear for the 2035 targets in the CO2 regulation. So I think for industry, when we talk to industry representatives, what we hear most is we need reliability. I mean, we have to keep in mind that these investments are made for many, many years upfront. So you're not just changing your model lines from 1 month to the other. That takes years. So really, reliability in the framework conditions is essential. But we also still need to work, at least in Germany, we very much still need to work on the consumer side, because also what we hear, for example, from charging infrastructure operators, their problem is really that what Jean-Luc was also saying, that the market is far behind what was projected some years ago. So they're now running into just economic problems. I mean, really, you were saying it's really about survival for many of the charging operators. And when we ask them what should policy do, is really just get the cars on the road, and then we'll have enough business to make it viable. So I think bringing at least in Germany, subsidies will be key. And I'm totally with Nicolas on the fossil fuel subsidies and the sort of the other side of the coin here. We really need to look into where do we still incentivize fossil fuel cars, and can that be restructured in a way to benefit electric vehicles without sacrificing social or other objectives that are targeted with these subsidies. For example, in Germany, we have a subsidy for commuters, and that is always put out as it's really essential for also the poorer populations, while in the way it is set up, it actually benefits those with higher incomes. So there is a lot of room there to actually restructure some subsidies that benefit the lower income people. And I think also with fossil fuel subsidies, there is still a lot of room, talking, for example, about company cars, to restructure those subsidies to benefit EVs, but also benefit socially disadvantaged populations a little bit more. Of course, that's very German-centric, but I think on the EU level, it's really about stability of regulation. Yeah, and I think also there is a lot already there, and some things were said. Local content requirements, of course, is one issue that could be addressed. We're also working on carbon accounting standardization, so I think that's really key if you're talking about local content that is compatible with international trade and not causing any trade frictions. So I think they're harmonizing carbon accounting standards, ideally on an international level. That would be a big step forward.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Marion. And yes, so we heard a lot that, well, there is a feeling that somehow if policymakers want this transition to electric cars in Europe, more needs to be done to roll out the market. So that justifies just consumption subsidies that are not going to scale up the market, that are not going to lead to innovation. There were also interesting remarks, Germany specific, how support for company cars is not targeted at electric vehicles, so it can still also lead to holding back the market transition. Of course, it's partly due to an ongoing debate of what the right solution would be. But we had another element that was mentioned quite a bit, which was the charging infrastructure. And here, Marion, you said, well, it's also a sort of a egg and a hen problem, right? The market isn't scaling up, then the charging infrastructure isn't profitable. But once it's profitable, it can be a challenge also for the electricity grid. And this is where Nastaran comes in, and her company, CM Blue. Perhaps you can describe a little bit, Nastaran, first, well, what this technology can do in the era of charging infrastructure, but also more generally in electrification. And then after that, we can talk a little bit about subsidies, which wouldn't be consumer subsidies in your field, but perhaps well, R&D support basically to develop the technology, which has other advantages in this geopolitical, for sustainability and geopolitical, let's say, fight for leadership, because we haven't talked about raw materials availability, but that's also a bit concentrated in China and some other countries. And you have solutions for all of that. So Nastaran, please do enlighten us a little bit what it is your company is doing and how it could help the transition to a more sustainable mobility.
Yeah. So thank you very much for the invitation. Let me start with what we are doing, because usually CM Blue is not really known. We are developing a battery for stationary storage. It's a long duration energy storage. And the battery itself uses only non-conflict materials. The whole battery can be sourced regionally, so there is no geopolitical dependencies on other countries. And the idea we have is a completely modular battery, meaning having battery modules with 40 kilowatt, 200 kilowatt hours. So we are not talking about domestic batteries, but really industrial batteries. And at the end, these modules can be stacked in a high-rack system. You can imagine it like a warehouse. it's at the end a warehouse for energy. So we have the battery modules in completely modular plug-and-play system. So this is where we are focusing on. We are still in the development of the battery. We are prototyping right now, and we'll hit the pilot phase soon. And this company was founded 10 years ago by our founder, Peter Geigler. He's a medical doctor, and he had already 10 years ago this idea of we need to be geopolitically independent, and we need like really abundant available material without any restrictions. So this is where we focused on, and this is what we developed, and also having a safe battery, because when you think about really large scale batteries of 200 megawatt hours or even more, you need safety. And yes, this is where we are working. And what does it mean for the discussion we are having here? So assuming that we have the EVs on the streets, so assuming we solve the problems and it's affordable for everyone, then we will need a lot of lithium ion and sodium ion batteries to make this possible. And we need the resources of these batteries for the EV market itself. And still, I assume that our behavior will not change, and we will still have like the expectation that we can charge our battery in 5 or 10 minutes and being mobile 24/7. I don't think this will change so soon. And this means that we need the same concept as we know it right now from gas stations. And just thinking of like in a few years when we have 5 or 10 cars at one charging station and all of them want to charge their batteries to go home or go for vacation or whatsoever, that's a huge strain for the grid. So it really stresses the grid. We need the stability there. And this is why we need buffer. And these buffer could be batteries. And then combining this idea with renewable energies, we need long duration batteries. So this is where I think we need to go to. We need like lithium and sodium ion batteries for the EV market, and we need another battery solution for the long duration market to have buffers, to have a stable grid, and also to make it possible to use renewable energies for charging EVs.
Yeah, perfect. So Nastaran, because well, you said you're still in the development phase, but it sounds like a really promising technology. So what do you need as a startup company that wants to come up with a new technology that can provide quite a bit of solutions? Is it mainly public support for R&D? Is it better collaboration with universities, or would you also say, well, it would help us if these markets develop? So basically subsidies for market scale up are also important. Where in your niche, let's say in this game, where do you see the needs that are addressed or are perhaps not addressed and need to be approached differently?
Yeah, I think so. What you said is completely right. We need like more or less everything of it. Some of it is already there, some not. So first of all, yes, R&D always needs support from universities and institutes, and I think that we have the support there. Batteries and also stationary batteries are now much more important than it was 10 years ago. So this is something, unfortunately, the geopolitical situation helped there. So this support we already have. And as for startups, it's always about funding. And especially such a startup as we are focusing on the batch, or we are starting from the battery material itself. So we are doing real chemistry, R&D, and also producing the materials. And then we also produce and develop the battery module itself and the system, including the software. We have like 250 employees in the company. So this is something where you really need funding and not just a little bit. And my perspective is that the focus of Europe or Germany is so much on lithium-ion batteries, and I understand that this is maybe the first step to make EV possible, but I also think that we need to prepare for the second step, for the alternatives, for the whole infrastructure, for the grid infrastructure and alternative batteries. And this is where I think the focus could be better.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. Perhaps I want to turn to you, Jean. Well, you work mostly on industrial subsidies and what they do to trade, but you also showed this nice picture where you said, well, it's only one element of industrial policy. And then Nicolas also made clear how difficult it is to develop a good policy instrument, toolbox or whatever in Europe. But in terms of the focus of public money being spent, and you're seeing the surge in subsidies, perhaps a subsidy race, right? And who knows what's going to happen with tariffs now. But do you think that, or according to OECD research, is well, the focus or the measures, are they right? Because we could also say, well, look, lithium batteries, very difficult to access lithium. Maybe we can move to, now I'm talking about the car battery, natrium or whatever other technologies that are more abundantly available locally. Jean-Luc also said that it's important to to develop not the local but the regional market, perhaps for everyone when there's a bit less cooperation globally. So should there be more R&D support and less of this consumer and producer subsidies, or where do you stand in this question? Or are there other measures like regulation that need to adjust European financial markets for startups?
So in general, I would say policymakers need to think carefully whether subsidies are the right tool for the job. Like there's many cases where people go for subsidies because politically it's easier. It's just public money. It's almost invisible because it's a public debt, so people don't think about it. Other measures can be more painful, especially the taxes and regulations and so on. So it's a bit the easy, low-hanging fruit for many people to go for. But even if you do decide the subsidies are the right tool for the job, and then there's cases where subsidies are the right tool for the job and the proper instrument to be using, there's the tendency to conflate objectives and design. And you can have a subsidy with very noble intentions that ends up being a total disaster. So it's not because the subsidy is green that it makes it good. It's not because it's for R&D that it makes it good. The devil is always in the details. It's about how it's designed. You can do a really well-designed green subsidy and a terribly designed green subsidy. And we heard today about like consumer subsidy design, about how important it is to carefully tailor it to the circumstances, to avoid it being regressive and so on. And the same is true on the production side. What I would also like to stress is that there was discussion about lithium and batteries, is that what I showed you was subsidies for car makers. But if you go up the chain, and it's work we have yet to do, I mean, we're doing it right now, but the data are not ready yet. But when you go up the chain to the battery makers, to auto parts companies like tier 1, tier 2 suppliers and so on, you also do find subsidies. So it's lithium availability or rare earth availability or nickel, cobalt, it's one thing, but then it needs to be processed. It needs to be put into anodes, cathodes, and so on. And then it needs to be assembled in batteries, and the batteries go into cars. And every step of that chain, you do find subsidized players, and you do find concentration. You do find the same problems popping up. So I think we face a very systemic problem that goes beyond just the final OEM stage and consumption stage. It's a subsidy supply chain, if you want, that starts with extraction, refining, mid-level manufacturing, assembly, and so on, up to the cars. But again, it doesn't mean that subsidies should never be used as always bad. It's not the case. There are cases of very good subsidies that make sense. And I think the consumer side, it makes total sense as long as you design the subsidy properly in terms of social goals and trade and so on. I think it's a wonderful tool, and if countries can afford it fiscally as well, of course. There's as many things to check for. But I think it's a really possible tool on R&D as well. R&D can be great. It's just that you have to be careful to not overshoot again. One example that comes to mind is not from the car sector, but the semiconductor industry, where basically every company, whether it's NVIDIA, Intel, Samsung, TSMC, their whole bread and butter is about innovating. So as companies, they don't succeed if they don't innovate. So there's no question that these companies will still spend on R&D with or without subsidies, because that's how they compete. They compete with R&D. So there's a question of whether we need to be so generous with R&D in this case. But in other cases, we do need to be generous, especially for startup companies that just cannot afford the R&D, don't have access to capital markets, cannot go to any bank and say, hey, lend me money, I have a great idea. So or cannot even issue bonds on the market. So I think there's a lot of nuances. I don't have a one-size-fits-all advice for you, except to say it's very complicated.
It's important to analyze deeply, and that's why we need institutions like the OECD and Agora and KlimaSozial and the Jacques Delors Center, also known as Notre Europe. Nicolas, to come back to this, this really complicated puzzle we've gone through, and you said it at the beginning, it's a complicated puzzle and a wholesale transition that Europe somehow needs to manage, and that's what you try to address a little bit in your strategy. But overall, would you say that it could be also, well, is there opportunity for European moment in this transition? And of course, what is also important to keep in mind with the right policy toolbox and perhaps cooperation in Europe, because there is European supply chains, of course, in car, but these supply chains, as Jean rightly pointed out, are also global. And Jean-Luc and Marion said, well, maybe there should be some local content requirements. On the other hand, Europe has also, the world has changed, of course, but Europe has long benefited from global supply chains. So how can this be managed with this transition? It's really lots of pieces that have to fit together, right?
Yeah, indeed. And we heard from Jehan that, you can always talk about spending and spending and spending, but it has to be paid somewhere. And we're in a situation where the fiscal space is quite tight, especially in France. Germany has a little bit more space in that regard. But we are also in a situation of a quasi-war, right? So defense spending is going up massively. So there's not going to be that much money flowing around as we may have been able to do in the past. So that's where I would come back also to Marion's point. We need to look at where regulation is actually working, and where there has been a lot of smart regulation in Europe over the last years, and they might not always be to everyone's liking because it can cut into specific profits, but they might be achieving the goals that they were intended to serve. So yes, we've seen an uptick in EVs, but the uptick in EVs is behind targets, right? So one of the most important outcomes from this strategic dialogue was that there is now an averaging of the CO2 targets between 2025 and 2027, which fine. I mean, you can say that gives some breathing space, but we have to be very, very careful that this is not going to basically impact our long-term targets until 2030, until 2035, because the problem remains that the most profitable models for car manufacturers are SUVs, are the more expensive models. That's where the profit margins are. So from a firm perspective, it's completely reasonable. They need to meet their quarterly results. There's only a limited amount of time horizon that they can consider for what they do. But from a public policy perspective, that might look slightly different, right? So we need to have some kind of incentive structure for firms, a clear framework where we're going to be in 2030, where we're going to be in 2035, and not going back and forth between different things, because we can otherwise well be in a situation where European ICE is still an excellent product in 2035 or 2040. But Chinese EVs are so far and beyond that it's basically going to be impossible to catch up. So that incentive structure needs to stay in place. Now, this question that you brought up about industrial subsidies, incentive structures for production-linked incentives. We can consider something like the Inflation Reduction Act in the US as maybe a positive example, but also a negative example. It seems to be working in the sense that, you know, it seems to encourage firms to put in money into the sector. The problem is that the US, for example, has not done it in a WTO consistent way, right? The US is obviously abandoning the WTO more and more. For Europe, that's not really an option, and not only on ideological grounds. We are much more dependent on trade compared to the United States. Our trade to GDP ratio is almost twice as high. So we need a predictable, open system. We need to remain consistent with WTO rules. So there are ways to do this, of course. I mean, the WTO agreements, the SCM agreement, they allow for ways to design this. But it basically means that you can't discriminate in certain ways, including with questions about local content requirements. So that remains an area where we have to be very, very careful about how to move forward. I noticed that there was a comment in the chat about corporate fleet incentives. I couldn't agree more. We have quite a bit about this in our report as well. The action plan for the European automotive sector also talks about having the fleet regulation at the EU level being pushed now this fall, which I think is very, very important. We have positive examples from multiple EU member states like Belgium, Sweden, Denmark, where there have been policies that allowed a very high rate of adoption of EVs in corporate fleets. And this has all these secondary effects for the second-hand market that Brigitte was talking about initially to push down the prices, because the corporate cars, they usually come on the second-hand markets just a couple of years after. So these are an indirect subsidy, right? These are tax breaks that firms get, but they can have a huge impact. That's certainly the evidence that we've been seeing from several member states. Let me leave it at that.
Great, Nicola. Brigitte, you raised your hand. I had a question to you, but please make your point first, and then
yeah, I just wanted to add one aspect. We talked a lot about subsidies and the right mix of instruments and so on. I think it's also important to take into account the time dimension, so that we have a proper sunset clause for subsidies, right? And it should be clear from the very beginning onward, what is the framework, what is the time frame, how do we decrease the subsidies over time, right? And in Germany, we had the bad example of stop and go, right? So huge amount of money, and then the program stopped immediately. But that's really not helpful, neither for car companies, not for the consumers. And Marion, you mentioned the reliability, and I think this is really important, and over time to match that with the subsidy scheme. So that was one aspect I wanted to mention, and also the proper evaluation of these subsidy schemes, right? So that you say, in 2 years' time, we make an evaluation, and then we can adjust a little bit here and there. But often the evaluation is completely disconnected to the setup of the subsidy program. So that was one aspect I wanted to add. And then also to the comment on the company cars, I would also fully agree what was on the chat. My fear is that in Germany, actually, we go in another direction. So in the coalition treaty, it says that they will even increase the price limit for EVs, company cars, to 100,000 euros. And this is not only problematic in terms of the social dimension, but also, I mean, from the climate perspective, Nicolas, you said we go more for SUVs, and they, of course, use more electricity, and that's not really efficient, and from the climate perspective, also quite problematic. So these were my 2 points I wanted to add.
Perfect. Thanks, Brigitte. And we are at the end, but I did want to ask Jean-Luc from his traditional automotive sector perspective. Well, one thing that basically comes up or pulls things a little bit together, because I was wondering, so Brigitte pointed out the way why she's thinking about these subsidies for consumers is basically with the idea, with an eye to scaling up the market, making sure that the pieces can come together, but she would then like these subsidies to disappear. And what I just wanted to ask you, and she showed at the beginning, I think you didn't see that that small cars, cheap cars, aren't really available for consumers, at least in Germany. And do you think if all these pieces can come together with the raw material availability, perhaps some subsidies to scale up the market, could then the charging infrastructure develop and of course continued R&D to innovate? Is it feasible to produce smaller electric vehicles for lower income households in Europe at competitive prices? Is that a business model that you see for the future with the right framework condition is even here?
Yeah, I mean, allow me to be super cautious because I'm in a B2B and I feel very, I would say, at ease in the sense that we are a tier one that is completely devoted to electrification and including, as I said it before, to affordable. As we survive. Are the French, to be very clear, at least for the European market. But I fully agree that there is, and it was a chart, and I was there, I was silent, but I saw the charts, and I think they're very right of what the consumer, I would say, panelists here have said, that we need to correct better the incentivization of cheap electrical vehicle. For sure, I think we need to target rather, like also in France, we are thinking on the social system for social security. I mean, for the ones that can afford, I mean, I'm sorry, there is no need to reimburse the medicine. Mm-hmm. Same story, I think, for to bring a better uptake for the lower and middle class of our continent. There should be some more, I would say, targeted schemes where we can be more efficient. And then I think that also for many company fleets, there could be company regulations where you promote more, I would say, sizable cars than just, bigger cars and in order also to promote that uptake. Now, this has not been the approach that has been taken, but this is really, honestly, it's really not my business as a B2B. It's more a consumer and a transportation business. What I would like to remind, regardless, because I saw the comment of Frank Joost, yes, indeed, many billion have been spent from the Commission, from the member states, and we can, as a sectoral representative, we can only think that. But if I take my very own responsibility, the level of my company, of all tier ones dedicated to electrification, is that we use 10% of our turnover into the R&D, and the level of capex for the production and the sites is immense compared to the level of subsidies we had. There is absolutely no scale to be compared on the opacity of what Chinese suppliers or automakers got as subsidies versus what we could get from Europe. So at that level, I would also say that we did our job and we took enormous financial risks for them, to what I was saying before, an uptake that indeed is not yet there, even if I can only be happy that in the last quarter, yes, there is an acceleration thanks to regulation. But as you well stated, and we all noted, the uptake that we are evaluating right now is not at all at the level of what was expected on the way, I would say, financial prediction has been stated and promoted and prepared 10 years ago. Because I remember the very big difficulty we have, and this is a very big deal, when tier ones and OEMs need to predict the market and they need to do it very much in advance, and a cycle of automotive takes 7 years for a durability of usage of a vehicle of 15 years. So when we mismatch the level of incentive, then this has huge consequences. When we're looking just as a consumer level, it's very difficult because it doesn't match this predictability at industrial level. So the measures needs to be taken also with that kind of time frame that is very difficult to reconcile between the industrial one and then the consumer one, where shifts can be made at last minute at a yearly level, but where before it takes into industrial sector, it takes time. So this is also a very big burden that unfortunately as a modest tier one, I cannot solve. But I just wanted to emphasize that as an industrialist, we did take the measure, and obviously we are very much recognized by that by both governments and European Commission. So anyway, we will survive. We will take the measures we need, and we will be staunch suppliers. This is why, again, as a final word, what I want to say, for us, local content is extremely important to maintain, in order that we maintain also a regional production and R&D scheme for our continent, as much as we are very present in Asia and in the Americas. And sorry, but I really need to leave because I need to rush into another meeting.
Yes, more meetings at the French embassy.
Yes.
Thanks, Jean-Luc, but also thanks, Jean, Nicolas, Marion, Nastaran, and Brigitte. I think for the breadth of what we had to cover, the time was short, but at the same time, I think we need to cover these issues in order to understand what's happening to the transition to electric vehicles. And I'm very grateful that you were all here to provide your perspectives. I'm also grateful to the audience who made important contributions to better understand what we're talking about. And well, next time we'll try to do this without technical issues, but I think we somehow managed. We will survive. We survived. Let's put it that way. Okay, see you soon. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Bye.